Full transparency before this video starts, pretending to be poor is not the same as being poor. I want to be direct about that because poverty tourism, the practice of voluntarily experiencing deprivation for content or personal growth and then returning to comfort, has a complicated relationship with the actual experience it's simulating. I lived on $25 for 1 week. I was never in danger, and I knew it was temporary. I could have ended it at any point, and none of that is true for the 38 million Americans living in actual poverty. And what that experience or the experiment produced was not empathy. You don't build genuine empathy for an experience by temporarily, sampling it. What it produced was specific practical knowledge about money management at constraints that I didn't have before. And then it turned out to be genuinely useful. And here's what I learned: the rules and why they were set the way they were. The experiment parameters: $25 for 7 days, covering all food, transportation, supplements, and any incidental spending, bills, rent, and existing subscriptions were excluded, not because they don't apply in real poverty, but because restructuring those would have required months, not days. And the experiment was designed around the discretionary spending decisions that happen within existing fixed cost structure. I had a full kitchen, transportation access, and a phone and internet connection throughout. The $25 figure came from attempting to approximate the supplemental nutrition assistance benefit for a single adult in a mid-tier cost of living area, which runs approximately $6 to $7 per day. The number is genuinely hard to live on in a modern American city. It becomes possible with specific knowledge and specific planning in the absence of emergencies, conditions that don't consistently exist in actual poverty, but that I could control for an experiment. Why running this experiment at all? Because I had been writing and thinking about personal finances for several years and had reached a point of recognizing that my framework for spending decisions was formed in a context of sufficiency. I had never had to think about money the way a person with very little has to think about it, with full intentions, with long planning horizons for small purchases, with zero margin for the casual inefficiencies that comfortable income absorbs without noticing. The experiment was an attempt to access that thinking under controlled conditions. Day one and two, the planning discovery. The first thing I discovered is that living on $25 a week is almost entirely a planning problem. It is not an endurance problem, a deprivation problem, or a willpower problem in the first days. It is a logistical problem. How do you allocate $25 across 7 days of food in a way that provides adequate calories and adequate nutrition in meals that are psychologically, sustainable to eat repeatedly? I spent the first 2 hours of day one on this planning problem rather than rushing to the grocery store. The allocation I landed on, $18 for groceries structured around the highest calories and around the highest nutrition and the lowest cost foods available. $5 held it as a buffer for any unforeseen need. $2 for the inevitable incidental that I'd underestimate in the planning. The grocery list that emerged from the constraint exercise: dried lentils, dried black beans, and a dozen eggs, a large container of oats, a bag of rice, and a head of cabbage, two sweet potatoes, and a bunch of bananas, a small block of cheese, a jar of peanut butter, and a stored brand bread. A total 1743. This list provides approximately 2,000 calories per day for 7 days, adequate protein, and enough variety to avoid the psychological collapse of eating identical meals every single day. What I discovered in the planning exercise is that most grocery spending has nothing to do with nutrition or calories. It has to do with the variety, the convenience packaging, the brand preferences, and the ambient marketing of a grocery store environment designed to generate unplanned purchases. And the 1743 grocery list brought more caloric and nutritional value than $80 I typically spend on a week of groceries for one person. The gap is almost entirely composed of premium for variety and convenience that have nothing to do with whether I was adequately fed. Day three and four, the cognitive load discovery. And by day three, I understood something about constrained income living that no amount of reading had given me. The cognitive load of managing money carefully under tight constraint is genuinely exhausting in a way that comfortable income never requires. Every purchasing decision at every moment required full calculation. The coffee at the gas station that I'd, have bought without a thought in my normal life required a decision tree. Does this fit in the remaining budget? What does spending this preclude later in the week? Is this worth the trade off? The entire structure of my spending cognitive shifted from ambient to automatic to effortful and constant. This cognitive load is not theatrical theatrical for people in actual poverty. It's their daily operating condition, not from one week as an experiment, but continuously without a known end date, with the real consequences for calculation errors and without the safety net of being able to opt out if it becomes uncomfortable. The research on cognitive bandwidth and poverty, describes this effective precisely. Experiencing a version of it for 4 days gave that research a texture it hadn't had as a theoretical concept. The practical implication I took from this, the behavioral advice directed at people with limited income: make a budget, plan your meal, track your spending, do your research before purchasing. It is not wrong, but it is advice generated by people who don't understand that it requires cognitive resources that are already fully consumed by the act of managing constrained finances. The advice is correct in principle and practically inaccessible to the people it's directed at for this specific reason. Day 5 and 6, the emergency problem. On day 5, I discovered why $25 per week without a buffer produces a financial fragility. I mean, my bus pass had 3 rides remaining, and I needed to get to an appointment 2 days later that required 4 rides. The bus fare for 2 additional rides were $4.50. Within my $5 buffer, manageable but painful to spend because it eliminated the buffer entirely. This is the precise mechanism by which financial fragility perpetuates itself at the margins. Every small emergency consumes a buffer that was protecting against the small emergency. The buffer, once consumed, doesn't rebuild until the next income cycle. Any expense between the buffer depletion and the income cycle has to be absorbed from the food or transportation budget, creating a downstream defix that $4.50 bus fare becoming a problem is not a failure of planning. It's the mathematically inevitable consequence of a budget with no margins for the small, unpredictable expenses that arrive continuously in every life, regardless of the income. The week produced for me a understanding of why financial advice that begins with build an emergency fund is correct and simultaneously useless as an entry point for people without margin. You cannot build an emergency fund when every small emergency immediately consumes whatever you were trying to save. The emergency fund requires slack. Slack requires income above the cost of basic needs. A significant portion of the American population does not have the slack. The advice is right. The condition for following it was absent. What the week actually taught me, this is going to be interesting. The useful learning were not about poverty. They were about my own spending and the degree to which my normal grocery and food spending is shaped by habits, ambient marketing, and the frictionless of comfort income rather than by actual needs. The $17.43 grocery week was the most nutritionally adequate and the most painfully constructed week of eating I'd had in years. And the food was boring by day 6. It was sufficient throughout, and the gap between sufficient and what I normally spend is enormous and composed almost entirely a premium for variety, convenience, and the ambient shopping that fills a cart without filling a need. I didn't emerge from the week with a converted relationship with food spending or a $25 grocery habit. I emerged with a recalibrated sense of what adequate costs and what the difference between adequate and comfortable represents in dollar terms. And that recalibration has persistently reduced my grocery spending without reducing my satisfaction. Because once you know what sufficient looks like, you can make a deliberate decision about how far above sufficient you want to spend and why, rather than spending by default. The experiment also produced a specific lasting discomfort about financial advice that assumes cognitive bandwidth, behavioral capacity, and organizational skills without accounting for the conditions under which those resources are available. Good financial advice for constrained circumstances require different premises than advice for comfortable ones. Most financial content, including most of my own, was written from the comfortable side of that line. That's worth knowing. Thanks for watching. If you're looking for more financial advice, check out this video to the right. It could do you some good. It does me some good just writing it and typing it and learning it all. So we'll catch you on the next one.